Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And your co-host Rich Gear here as well. And we again have Dr. Jerry Bergman here with us, and he's going to talk about some insights, overall presentation dealing with one of the most famous or infamous trials, depending on your viewpoint, of the famous monkey trial, the Scopes trial. It's the 100th anniversary of that, right, Doug?
That's right. 100 years ago, this is what took place. Now, we're going to have a lot of new revelations about what took place at this trial. Jerry has done some extensive research about
Yes.
how this actually shaped a lot of American thought and how it's been a nemesis for the Christian faith for a long time. And so, Jerry, we're going to turn it over to you and let you go ahead and talk about the Scopes trial.
Okay, it is most famous trial in American history. The claim is it was evolution versus creation. And that really was the focus of some people, the atheists in the trial. But in fact, it was something very different. It was mainly, according to what Bryan's concern was racism. And I'll show you that in some detail. What's it all about? A law was passed in Dayton, Tennessee, and outlawed the teaching of notice I said the word human evolution. And the ACLU challenged that because back even 1925, evolution was widely believed, even though back then they really had no clear evidence. In fact, the evidence today, which is used to defend evolution, 90% of it did not exist back then. Okay, Darwin proposed evolution in 1859, and basically evolution is an explanation for the creation without a creator. Goes Monkey Trial, 1925. Emerson versus the Board of Education. That's a court case. And then since then, we have many new cases. And so the result was Christians are now horribly conservative Christians who believe in the creation account are horribly misrepresented. And I've written 5 books on that, as most of you know. And Slaughter to Dissonance is one. Censoring the Darwin Dissonance is another one. And Silencing the Darwin Dissonance are 3 of the books. There's John Scopes. He was an agnostic is probably the best way of describing him. This is Clarence Darrow and Jennings Bryan. These are the 2 people that basically represented the state. Bryan did in this case, and Darrow. His whole goal, he said this, was to bring out and discredit religion. That's what he said. That's his whole goal. That wasn't Bryan's concern at all. Bryan's concern was, ironically, the rights of, the common people. Bryan was very active in defending the rights of the common people. And one common people he was defended, which I'll give you some quotes, was the blacks. There you can see another picture of the trial. There's a lot of pictures, by the way, taken, hundreds. And there you can see in the courtroom, it was packed. There was so much, but they were concerned the floor would collapse. So they brought the trial towards the end outside. Now, back then, what I'm trying to show is that evolution was thoroughly, completely, totally believed. If you rejected evolution, there must be something wrong with you. And this is true from about 1880 on, because the scientific world was by and large convinced that evolution was true. So true that in this cartoon, there's supposedly a fundamentalist, and he's dragging his young son in the mud. And his son says, "Pa, must we wait around in this mud all of our lives?" And of course, the fundamentalists, down with education, you have to be ignorant not to accept, they believed, evolution in that day. Another example, thou shalt not. There's the tree of knowledge, evolution, archaeology, biology. And our children, because of fundamentalists, are prevented from seeing that knowledge. So fundamentalism is a block. Fundamentalism, ironically, the book, The Fundamentals, was where it came from. And ironically, the fundamentals in that book accepted evolution. It surprises people, but they accepted evolution. What the goal of fundamentalists was to stop focusing on all this Mickey stuff, this minutia. And so, what's really important? What are the fundamentals of Christianity? Is uh, swimming in a lake with your bathing suits? Is that wrong? Is that important? What are the fundamentals that you have to accept in order to call yourself a Christian? And they wanted to eliminate a lot of this minor stuff that Christians have been arguing about for decades. So that was the whole goal. What's really important? What are the fundamentals? And the fundamentals, by the way, were pretty liberal compared to what we accept today. Which brain belongs to an intelligent design person? Well, obviously C, the small one, because people who reject evolution, the intelligent design crowd, are basically ignorant. And here's a cartoon where the Pope, the previous Pope, I'm not sure where the current Pope is at on this, but the previous Pope basically said that science has proven evolution and therefore creation and intelligent design are now being crushed. So they're saying even the church accepts the evolutionary worldview. And here we go, evolution on one side, lots of facts. On the other side, creation, all we have is faith and some loony preacher that basically says, well, they should be taught in the classroom. Another one, which I can thank someone on Richard for this. You could not see this, the copy I had. It was unreadable, and now he did such a great job, you can really read it. So Tennessee legislature is there with the Red Russian Guard. So he's trying to say that the Tennessee legislature is basically like the Communist Guard. Is science being taught in our schools? This is The Onion, which makes fun of lots of things, including the creationists. Should children be exposed to facts? Are reason and empirical evidence suitable subjects in school? Well, you can see again, okay, as human beings, what do we accept? And this is a chart of people who accept that humans evolved from an early species of animals. You can see that the percent is the light blue is the greatest amount, is the ones who accept the human evolution. And you can see in Iceland, about 80%, going all the way down to the greatest, and aside from Turkey, is USA. So of all these countries, and we didn't look at all the countries in the world, but of all the countries they surveyed, USA, the highest percent of people reject the idea that humans evolved from an earlier form of life, earlier species. So according to what the cartoons we looked at earlier say, basically, we must have a lot of dumbbeats in this country. We must have a lot of stupid people, a lot of ignorant people. Well, let's see if that's true. Let's look at the most prestigious award in science, and that is the Nobel Prize. And these dots here show, I think you can see it. Let me see it.
Kind of small, but it's all right. Yeah.
Okay, you can see there the country that won by far the most number of Nobel Prizes for science and other fields was the United States. We basically swamp all the other countries. So this group of people, US, that the evolutionists say must be stupid because they reject evolution, and yet we have achieved more in science than practically all other countries of the world combined. Number 2 is United Kingdom, 3 is Germany, 4 is France. Now we get down to Sweden, Switzerland. Hardly any Nobel Prizes were awarded to people from those countries. And here, what is the contrast? Well, this is not a science book, this cartoon says, the Bible. And so they're saying that we can't rely upon the Bible for truth. We have to rely upon science for truth. So today, this idea is still widely accepted. Mencken said this, and this is a good example of the name calling, which is so common. I did a debate not too long ago, about 80,000 views, and the response, I think about 2,000 people responded, and 98%, close to that, basically the response against me was mocking. And this is a very common response that evolutionists have toward imbeciles, which they say is us. And therefore, there's a problem with this because I would think if I have a good case, I will present it. If evolutionists have a good case, they will present it. So why do they resort to name calling? Well, because they don't have a good case. And this is what Mencken, H.L. Mencken, he had a lot to say about the Scopes trial, by the way. Mencken said about Bryan, he leads a new crusade, one somehow, well, despite his imbecilities, but no one laughing at him, underestimate, he can shake and inflame ignoramuses as no other man. And so he is saying nasty things about Mencken. Again, if he had the facts, present them, but he doesn't, so he name calls. Lots of books written about the Scopes trial, well over 100. I have at least 100.
I just said you probably have them all.
Yeah, when a book comes out, I try to buy it. But anyways, one of the better ones is Edward Larson's Somewhere for the Gods. But still, even though that's one of the better books, it says the Scopes trial and America's continuing debate over science and religion. Well, the Scopes trial was basically not about science versus religion. It was about two worldviews at best. Another book, The Great Monkey Trap, Science versus Fundamentalism, and there we go again, science versus religion. And this book had Clement's Science versus Religion, and then my book here, The Other Side of the Scopes Trial. And I conclude at its heart, the trial was about racism at its heart. And that's not a very popular response. Most people say it's science versus religion, but indeed, you can make a good case, which I think I have, that at its core, it was about racism. Okay, in The Commoner, Bryan expressed his concerns about a number of things, namely the Negro population, he said. Educational advantages should be open to both races. He said this in 1902, and he at this time was living in the South, and I'm surprised there wasn't a lynching for him saying a thing like this. This was not accepted at all, but Bryan was pushing for it. And again, 1902, he was 50 years ahead of his time, and so many of the things that Bryan wanted did not become reality until the late 50s. In fact, actually until the late 70s. Okay, evolution, one of many books. Humans evolved slowly from fish. You can see at the bottom was a fish. We work our way up to mammals and primates and humans. And this is from a 1932 book. And this section happens to be from Scientific American, but the same picture was reprinted in many textbooks. And you can see Java Man, Piltdown Man, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon. And now what do we know today? Java Man has been discredited. Piltdown Man was a forgery. Neanderthal Man is just another human type. You got blacks, you have whites, you have people from Oriental countries, from Asian countries, and you have Neanderthals. So Neanderthal is simply, as one article said, one of us. Cro-Magnon, same thing, just another human. So what has happened to the evidence for evolution? Now it is all gone from the evidence that was used then. So my point is, in spite of there being really no evidence we recognize today, back then, it was widely believed as true. Now, this is from a textbook. And again, we see the same pictures, the same Java Man, Piltdown, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, etc. Java Man, just briefly, what does Java Man consist of? A skull cap and some femurs, one femur actually. The femur is well recognized today as from a human, and the skull cap is basically recognized as not a Java Man, but as probably some type of ape. There's Java Man. The upper cranium and femur were found, and yet this is the picture of Java Man. How could his skin color, hair distribution, and so on be represented? Well, it's a guess. It's artistic license. There is a chart back then in the 1927, actually, and you can see the evidence back then they used to prove human evolution has largely been falsified. And the claim missing links, well, in this case, Dubois, the claim was the Java Man. Conclusion from a modern textbook, the fossil aroused much controversy, Java Man, but yet, well, there were almost 80 articles published on his finding. And yet today, few accept Java Man was a transition form between apes and humans. So today we recognize that it wasn't. And this is from the Curtis book, Java Man. It's the complete history of the find. Piltdown Man, and that is, of course, totally recognized as a fraud. And I find this picture interesting. These are great scientists carefully looking at this skull they found, and they're pictured to be very intelligent, wise, etc. And yet this was based not only on a forgery, but a bad forgery, a very bad forgery. If you do much reading about this find, we can recognize today that even though it wasn't exposed until the 50s, that it was a fraud. It's also called the Fossil Man of Sussex. So it had several names.
1912 to 1952 or something like that.
52, yeah, about that.
Yeah.
And there we can see Unraveling Piltdown and Piltdown Hoax, Who Done It. There's about 30 books written about Piltdown Men, which I have most of them. How about Neanderthal Man? Well, this is how they were pictured around 1910, I guess. This is from the American Museum of Natural History. Very primitive, like man. Another picture. Other pictures of Neanderthal. And now what do we understand about him? Well, this is a picture in a German museum, actually in the Neanderthal Museum in Germany. And they say he's all dressed up and nowhere to go. And the next picture is one based on Neanderthal bones. They had experts put a face, eyes, and so on the bones, and this is what they came up with. Now, that's a girl, it's a young girl, and they've done with adults as well. And now we find that they look basically like people do today. There's some differences, of course, but there are differences between various racial groups, so this isn't unusual. National Geographic said 16 years ago, the other humans, Neanderthals revealed, and they basically point out that Neanderthals are just, well, other humans. And if National Geographic says it's true, it must be true.
Oh boy.
Another example, Homo rhodensis. And again, this has been shown to be, claimed to be an intermediate between Neanderthal and modern man, but shown to be not valid. Yet you still see these pictures today. Here's Neanderthal Man. You can see Cro-Magnon next and modern man at the top. And there's Cro-Magnon Man. And there's his skull. And the skull says, it could be you. Cro-Magnon skulls look just like our own. A few differences, but on the other hand, no difference greater than we find today among different races. And then again, an illustration showing evolution. All of this, I must stress, has now been refuted. They recognize that this, what they call a progression, clearly invalid. Clearly. Australopithecus was one other example. Now, this wasn't exposed until shortly after the skull trial, but indeed, you can see Australopithecus and his wife and the animals around them, and this now has been shown to be nothing more than a pig's tooth. And this is a book that Bryan, written about Bryan, and Earth Speaks to Bryan, and this was done by Osborne, and he basically showing how can you deny the fact of evolution? Here we have Australopithecus, hunters which lived 100,000 years ago, so stop denying reality. End of story. And some claim that this wasn't accepted by science. Well, in Science magazine, one of the most important magazines published in the world in science, This is an article about Australopithecus showing indeed that back then they accepted this as a valid missing link between apes and modern man. And another example of the changes that occurred in evolution, human evolution. And again, this is false. And this is a book that I completed, which, by the way, has been a poor seller. And the reason why is they open it up and they see it's got probably close to 8,000 references from the paleontological literature, small print, and no pictures. And a lot of people say, I don't want to read that, although some people have. So I'm flattered that some people have. But what I show in here is that all the claimed missing links all have been disproven by fellow paleontologists. Now, they still believe in evolution, but they advocate the idea that my theory is correct, your theory is wrong. Here's all the evidence I have against your theory. What do you think of my theory? So my friend comes up and says, well, you may not like my theory, but I think my theory is better than your theory, and I want to tell you what's wrong with your theory. And so paleontologists have themselves disproved each other, and all we did in this book is basically line them all up and say, here's one set of paleontologists, and they criticize these paleontologists, and these paleontologists likewise show good reasons why the other paleontologists' ideas are not true. But now they still believe in evolution, so there's got to be some evidence out there. But the problem is, of course, it doesn't matter what the evidence says. Another thing they brought up, the Scopes trial, which is now foolish, but it's a claim of vestigial organs, that there was about 100, and this was evidence they used to support evolution, which today we recognize is not true. And the tape I did, vestigial organs, from 100 to none. In spite that this is a complex topic, the David Reeves Ministries did a good job putting this together, and it's actually been one of my better sellers in videos. And then my book on useless organs, or vestigial organs, has been translated into Arabic, which has done quite well in the Arabic world, probably better than in the English world. And these are the two books that I finished recently. Useless Organs claims that some organs are of no use, they're vestigial. And then the other one is Poor Design, that claims that that we have poor design, like our back and so on. I show all these are wrong. Okay, Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Acts 17:26. From one man, Adam, he made every man, woman, and every race of humanity, and he spread us all over the globe. Clearly, the scriptures, what has been taught here in the Bible, has been shown to be correct. Evolutionists have failed to come up with a viable evidence for evolution from our so-called ancestor, the ancestor chimps and humans. That's called the common ancestor, and they've have been able to demonstrate that effectively in the fossil record. I should mention that when they try to show evolution, they always start out with a chimp and show how that evolved into modern humans. The problem is they don't believe that. They believe that chimps and humans have a common ancestor. The problem is they haven't been able to find that common ancestor, and they can hypothesize what it looks like, but there's no consensus on what that common ancestor is. In the Commenter, that's a magazine that Bryan edited, and he frequently wrote about his concerns. Again, in 1902 article, he wrote, "The legal rights of the black man, there can be no question. He has all the legal rights that everybody else has. The Negro is a citizen, and as a citizen, he is entitled to all of the guarantees of the federal and state constitution." And again, this became true in paper, at least, only in the 1950s. It became true in reality only a decade or so ago. The black man, the Negro, has freedom to speak and write, freedom of conscience, and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those who pushed Jim Crow laws wanted to prevent the integration of people judged as a, quote, inferior racial stock. And, of course, Bryan disagreed with that. He said the Negro must be educated, free education, which of course didn't really begin until the 50s. The whites for their good as well as for the good of the Negroes. We must ensure that public schools are open to every child, white and black. Again, 1902, he said this. And that was obviously strongly opposed, especially in the South, until they were forced by a number of presidents to integrate, which we've seen videos of this part of history. There was a huge amount of opposition, well, murders over this Supreme Court ruling that said exactly what Bryan wanted. Okay. The school should be open to every child, white and black. And that's what they fought for. Okay, the book Scopes used in the trial was a civic biology textbook by George Hunter. And this book, Eugenics, was one of the primary reasons Scopes prosecutor Williams Jennings Bryan came to oppose the teaching of human evolution. This book, and he didn't bring out this a lot in the trial, and I think one reason why was that this case was in Dayton, Tennessee. There's a problem because the people in that town strongly opposed these ideas of human equality. And they strongly supported the ideas that we should teach that indeed we're all created by God as according to the Bible. Quotes, if stock domesticated animals can be improved, the health and vigor of the future generations of men and women on earth might be improved by applying them the laws of selection. This is known as eugenics. And eugenics was a focus of that book. And that was something Bryan was strongly opposed to. As the quotes I gave are pretty clear. Eugenics means well-born. And this book includes the fallacious stories. Now we know they're fallacious, the Jukes and Kallikaks. And these are stories of supposedly, there we go. There was Martin Kallikak. And the theory is that he was kind of promiscuous when a young man, was a young sailor. He dallied with some feeble-minded tavern girl. I'll get it. She made lots of kids. All these kids end up doing really poorly. Every one of them. They end up with being drunks and criminals and retarded and so on. Then he straightened himself up and he married a nice Quaker girl. And from her, they had lots of kids. All the children have done really well. They became judges and pastors and doctors and ministers, etc. Did really, really well. And this picture was used in Nazi Germany to try to convince the people that the story is true. The problem is the Jews, though. Dally with the Jews, we end up with all these derelicts. When we have relations with, when we marry nice German girls, kids turn out really well. Well, the biggest problem with this is, hey, the father is the same in all these cases. It's just the mother that made the difference. Obviously, we know that no matter how good the mother is, the father's pretty important as well. And so therefore, this implies that all the kids turned out bad because the mother wasn't the father, because he married somebody else and all the kids turned out really well. The other picture here is a Kallikak. It's a word they made up, by the way. It's not a real word. The Kallikak family, it basically was a study heredity, arguing indeed that how we produce a superior race is we use eugenics. We prevent the weak from breeding. We encourage the strong, the healthy, the vigorous, the bright to have big families. And they show this girl, this story is about her family. They show her on the cover reading a book. Then in the text, it says that she couldn't read. Well, she could read and did read and read a lot. She liked especially romance fictions. Okay, so this kind of a capsule of the teaching of the book that Scopes used. Present time, there exists on the earth 5 races of Rhodesian Man, each very different from the other. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type. This is the lowest. Then the Mongolian or yellow race. Finally, the highest of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. Clearly racist. And I think that, well, I know that Bryan was very opposed to this, And that's one reason why he went to court, was because that was totally against what he believed. So the improvement of man, if we can improve domesticated animals, well, why can't we do the same with people? We breed our cows to, to produce more milk or whatever. Why can't we breed our people to become better people? And eugenics was pushed throughout this book, which was at trial in the Scopes trial. And basically, they go on and they say all the problems, or most of the problems in our society, are due to breeding with inadequate people. If we all bred with good people, we made sure that the best bred with the best, we would have a best society. The remedy, if such people were lower animals, we'd probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading offspring. And humanity, he says, for animals would not allow this. But we should do this for people. We should prevent intermarriage with people who are low and degenerate races, he said, basically. And this is a book I did on the Holocaust. And of course, what was the whole goal of Hitler? Eugenics. He was trying to produce a superior race. That was his whole goal. So, Hunter believes society could perfect the human race by preventing intermarriage between the mentally ill, criminals, epileptics, etc., etc. He also believed the Caucasian race was the highest of all races. So, this was obviously important in the Scopes trial. Why is religion versus science over and over stressed? Because Clarence Darrow strongly believed we must do what we can to eliminate Christianity, and this is one way we can put the kibosh, can step on, we can affect adversely Christianity, and that's what it was trying to do. Some of these ideas are still around today. The Life in 1961 article. Now, they don't talk about evolution here. They don't talk about inferior races, but look at it. What do you see? Do you see monkeys? Right next to it's a less evolved human. And on the other page, you can see all these less evolved humans. Okay, comments, questions? Was I convinced? Was I convincing?
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff to digest. I'll tell you that right now. Yeah. Um, oh boy, where do you begin? I don't. Doug, where do you want to begin?
Well, I would say that the Scopes trial was probably one of the biggest things that caused harm to Christianity back in 1925. It created an environment where people started to treat education as a tool to indoctrinate people against Christian thinking. And so the other thing that happened was that you had a lot of denominations adopting evolution and compromising with it. And so I remember back in, I was looking at the 1861 book that I have from my great great grandfather. And it was a reader that talked about the day age theory and the gap theory, and they were touting them as possible explanations for all the long ages that was introduced by Lyell and
The
Darwin.
Darwin used to build his theory on because
So
you needed time.
really early on, that
Yeah.
the church just started to cave and
Yeah.
compromise with it, and yet they didn't examine the evidence against evolution. They had no idea what they were thinking.
Well, Doug, it seems to me in so many respects, we know, I mean, Clarence Darrow was out and out. I don't, would you say he was an atheist, Jerry, or an agnostic? He was,
Probably agnostic, yeah.
yeah, because I mean, I have always find it interesting that they want to get rid of Christianity, yet they still want to hold on oftentimes to the moral basis of which they would have no basis for it if they get reject a religious or Christian worldview. You don't have any basis for morality, and when you do that, it's up. You just have consensus. That's all you have. But the thing was, is that they always, when you talk about they do name calling, ad hominem argument, that was a lawyer. That's been a lawyer's trick forever. It's like they would so they have a witness on the witness stand, right? And the lawyer would come up and say, well, yeah, but she's a prostitute. Well, okay, that immediately makes her suspect, but did she really see what she said she saw? Did she see the murder? Really, it's kind of a way to sideswipe what's really the arguments are. And I find that in your books, Jerry, you write a lot about those kinds of things, the science and as far as that goes, and it gets more and more complicated. It's just unfortunate that there's a diabolical convergence of idea things that come out at certain times and the opportunistic thing that happens that they didn't have all the knowledge that we have now about the cell and about some of the stuff that we know now. They didn't know about the fraudulent Piltdown Man. Hesperopithecus was not known to be a peccary or a extinct pig or whatever. Whatever it's, they didn't know this stuff, and so they use it. But it's interesting that your premise about Bryan wanting seemed to be a little bit lame on some of his arguments because he wasn't really concerned about some of the stuff. He's more concerned about the inherent value of a human being, i.e., blacks and all races are basically creating the image of God. So he didn't really always have the best or the strongest arguments. But then again, they didn't have some of the knowledge that we have today. We've been very fortunate, I think, in modern things to be able to defend it. It seems to me that oftentimes the evolutionary lobby is doing the very same thing that the Catholic Church did in the Middle Ages. They're relying upon authority rather than facts. Okay, and they're doing the same kind of thing, and they have a dominant worldview in some respects, but there's a lot of chinks in their armor. There's a lot of chinks in their armor. The eugenics was a part of an absolute outcropping or outgrowth of Darwinian thinking. Is one of the scandals of the 20th century, or well, actually 19th, 20th, and 21st century, if you will, the eugenics and that kind of stuff all the way. And you documented a lot of that over the years in many of your books, Jerry. But I was fascinated by this presentation. I think you did a good job, and there's a lot of facts to digest, though.
Well, some people ask me, in fact, a lot of people ask me, why am I so interested in this? Well, as most of you know, I was taught at Bowling Green State University for 7 years, and I published a monograph by Phi Delta Kappa. This monograph is a very prestigious monograph series, and I published it, and basically I didn't argue for one or the other. I said we need to look into the issue. We need to consider the creation arguments and the evolution arguments, and we need to evaluate the two worldviews. Well, that did not go well at all with my colleagues. In fact, they made it very clear in the court case when they basically fired me. In the court case, they made it very clear that they objected strongly to that monograph. In the court, the judge basically said, Scopes trial all over again. And so I have a feeling that basically the Scopes trial was the precedent. Now, this wasn't written in the decision, but I have a feeling the precedent for my case was the Scopes trial. And they're basically saying Bergman is teach. Of course, I wasn't teaching creation, but Bergman published this monograph, which clearly presents creation in a favorable light. And therefore, Scopes trial, Scopes 2, therefore, we need to do what they should have done with Bryan back then. We need to deal with this case by, in this case, making sure that Bergman doesn't teach at the university. And so, and then, of course, as people who know me, that was a difficult period of my life, and I had to basically start all over. And they basically made it clear that.
Dr. Bergman, would you say that other cases may have been influenced by the Scopes trial as well?
Oh, no question. In my case, it was mentioned. So
there we go, Jerry.
Specifically
okay,
mentioned.
I fixed it.
So in my case, it was mentioned. And in my case, they really had no other reason. And they admitted that I was the most productive faculty. No question. I had letters from the dean that said I was the most productive faculty. My student ratings were good. My service was good. The three things that are critical are teaching, service, and research. And I was high in all of those. They admitted that. And so they had to come up with another reason. So they came up with reasons, and I'll give you one example. On my resume, I had written, I noticed on my resume, I had a chapter in a book. And this chapter I wrote. And so they had the book in the hearing. And by the way, I was not allowed to go to this hearing. My peers went there, and I was not allowed to be there. And basically, one of my nemesis basically brought up this. Bergman's Vita said he's published this chapter. Well, here's a copy of the book. Chapter's not in there. she's lying. And it turned out that they had a different edition of the book. My chapter was in the third edition. They had the second edition. And so that's why my chapter wasn't in there. Now, the responsible way to respond is ask me. Somebody should have said, wait a minute, you brought up the meaning that you did not write this chapter, it was not in the book, so could you explain? And I'd look at it and I'd say, well, that's the wrong edition. That's my chapters in the newer book. And so that would have been easily taken care of, but my feeling is they knew they were wrong, and they deliberately misled the committee that evaluated my credentials by things like this. And this to me is horribly unethical. I mean, it just really scoundrels. And this was disappointing because here I was working with professors at a major university who had doctorate degrees, who were well esteemed in their field, and yet they were doing stuff like this. This is just absurd. And so that's, I guess, the first really bad experience I had in academia was this. And the reason was pretty clear from the court trial that the creation issue was up front. Even though they had no evidence I was teaching creation. In fact, they never really claimed I was teaching creation, except in that fastback.
What year was this, Jerry, this happened? All this happened?
1980.
1980. Wow. Yeah, I know. But see, Jerry, the thing about it is the nature of man doesn't change whether you're smart or not. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's true.
And it reveals that so often. I see that in the world, just whatever, anything we have idea systems competing. Those who don't have a moral core are going to lie, cheat, steal, and do it. What did Jesus say? You have your father, the devil. He was a liar and a murderer and a thief from the very beginning, and these people are that way. I hate to, because it sounds like I'm using ad hominem arguments, but you could say by their fruit you're going to know them. And when they're doing out and out lying about stuff, it's very, very obvious. But the other thing that always gets to me is how vehemently and how vociferously they argue. If there's no God, what do you care if I'm deluded? I mean, how have I harmed you? These people, it's the old Shakespearean line, methinks thou dost protest too much. It's like they know there's something out there, and they just, their heart is it stirs up the angry in them, and there's no reason for that if it's just everything was just a blank, objective, secular naturalistic world with no value systems applied to it. Why do they have such a big anti-value system to this? I mean, that to me belies their heart, and it's there. It's on the surface almost. And what happened to you is just, it's unconscionable. It's terrible.
And that's a good point you made. I wonder why they were so vociferous, why they were so anxious to get rid of me. My issue was I always admired professors. When I was sixth grade, I wanted to be a college professor. And I worked hard from sixth grade through my doctorate degree, working hard to earn the credentials I needed to be a professor. I looked up to these guys, and it's very disappointing when you find out they're not what I thought they were. They're not a group that you really, and you can see that now, especially at Columbia University, where you have all these anti-Semitics marching around and yelling and screaming. They want Israel. I guess they want all the Israelites to go home, just pack up and leave and go somewhere else. I'm not sure what they want, but on the other hand, it's disappointing, I think, and a lot of people, especially in the past few years, are very disappointed with academia. Harvard and Columbia especially are getting, Trump's taking Harvard to court and saying, look, you got to have programs to not discriminate against Jews. And Harvard says, look, we'll discriminate against who we want to. It's us. That's our decision. We don't want you to be involved. And so with not just with me, but with more and more people are become discouraged about academia and what's going on. In fact, there's cliches about nutty professors. Yeah, your professor said this, and yes, you know how much credibility he has. Not much. And so it's a problem I think that academia has to deal with. And they're not willing to deal with it, I suppose, because they're basically a family and they guard their own, and they're very protective of their own, and they don't want anybody to be part of their family. And that includes people who question their worldview. Studies consistently show about 80 to 90% of all professors are either Democrats or socialists or communists or something else. It's a rare professor that's Republican.
Yeah, and professor, especially, most of them are agnostic at best.
And true, most of them are agnostic.
I have a question concerning trials that have occurred in the recent past, pitting creationism or intelligent design against evolution, and there's been other judgments that have ruled against the teaching of creation in public schools. Tell me how this compares with the Scopes trial.
Well, one thing is they're consistent. I have documented in my 5 books over 200 court cases, and every one of them rules the same. Creation is religion, evolution is science, and the fact is creation and evolution are worldviews. And worldviews answer 3 basic questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going? Evolution, where do we come from? We evolved. Why are we here to survive? Where are we going? When we die, we die. Christianity, religion answers those same questions in different ways. Why are we here? God created us. Or sorry, where do we come from? God created us. Why are we here? To serve God and serve our fellow man. Where are we going? When we die, we have a choice to go to heaven, to be with God, or to live everlasting life on the earth, as many churches teach. And so, same questions they answer. They're both worldviews. And what we're saying is, the court said you can only teach one worldview, or actually one religion. You can't teach the other worldview. And so basically, schools indoctrinate students into one religion. Word religion is a bad word to use because it implies a lot of things. But basically, worldview is your religion. And basically, we're talking about 2 religions. And the courts have accepted atheism as a religion. You can, on a form, when it asks for religion, you can put down atheism. And so basically, the courts have said you can teach one religion, but you cannot teach the other worldview. And that is, of course, the theistic worldview. And to me, we're indoctrinating people the same as Nazi Germany did. There's really, in that way, we're the same.
I find it
I
very
think,
ironic, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've understood, I've read things, and Doug and I have talked about it. And Clarence Darrow himself, didn't he make a statement that it's the highest form of bigotry or arrogance to only teach one form of origins? Wasn't that during the Scopes
yeah, that
trial?
was during the Scopes trial, and right.
And now the shoe's on the other foot. Now, see, this is what I find out with people who are really evil is they only want to appear benign and fair-minded when they're in the minority or they're not in the ascendant. But when they become in the ascendant, they are not. They are just as intolerant or more intolerant than the other supposedly horrible, intolerant viewpoint. I've never seen it not be that way. You can see this from the French Revolution on to everything when to now the gay lesbian stuff. Once you get into an ascendant, suddenly you can't speak against. They say you have no freedom to speak about the moral quotient on it. And creation evolution, it was the same way when Clarence Darrow made that statement. But now suddenly, well, now they're only teaching one view of origins. Why is that? Why is that not bigotry?
But
See,
back then they were arguing for the 2 model approach. They're arguing we should teach both creation and evolution. That's what they're arguing about. So that's why
that's because
that
they weren't in
statement
the
was made.
ascent. That's because evolution, except in academia, was not in the ascendant in as far as the common society. It was not in the common vocabulary, if you will, or in the education thing. So they were not in the ascendant. They were in the not necessarily the minority, but they were not in the power structure. So
Right.
they wanted to appear fair-minded until they got into the end of the thing. And then it's like the old camel gets his nose in the tent. He takes over the whole tent, and now there's no tolerance there at all. There's no equanimity. There's no fair-mindedness at all. It's my way or the highway.
That's
This is what
true.
they accused us of being, and yet they themselves are that. This is what the other thing I noticed is that the old adage, you point the finger and 3 fingers point back to you. They're always pointing the finger, and 3 fingers are always
Yeah.
pointing back to them. But they have no sense of self-evaluation. They don't seem to have this ability to look inwardly and say, "Wow, what I said they're doing, I'm exactly doing." They have
Yeah.
no they have no ability to do this. It
So
seems to me.
Crystal, what are your thoughts? We haven't heard much from you.
I've got a few questions for you.
Sure. Okay,
Um,
please.
I'll take Joe's there in the chat first. Joe wants to know, was evolution a major part of indoctrination with the Nazis?
Oh yeah, it was central, although it wasn't called as evolution as such, but basically, yeah, evolution was central, very important in the Nazi movement. And not only Darwin, of course, but also Darwin's disciples, people that Darwin affected, like Marx. And although the Nazis were very anti-communist, but nonetheless they were influenced by a lot of the ideas which Darwin has pushed, and especially the ideas of racial inequality. So they relied heavily upon the Darwinian ideologues to push that worldview. So yeah, that was very, very important. In fact, World War II, the best description of World War II was, again, like the Scopes trial, it was between uh, two groups, between the inferior races and the superior races. And the superior races had the worldview that they had a right to rule because they were superior. It was their right. And the inferior races, well, they had to do the best they could to survive. And so that's the best example of that is that during the war, when they realized they were losing, and the generals wanted more supplies and troops to the front, which was in Russia at that time. And the other issue is we need the trains to bring the Jews, especially from Hungary, to the camps. So what's more important, winning the war or bringing the Jews to the camps? Well, the decision was made basically to remove the Jews from Hungary to the camps, and they killed almost a million in the last 6-8 months of the war. And so therefore they made it very clear what was more important. In fact, why didn't they invade Great Britain? Why didn't they finish that? Because the British were primarily Caucasians. There weren't many Jews there. So that's not the concern. In fact, Hitler couldn't understand why Britain didn't just side with Hitler. But how about Russia? Well, Russia and Poland especially had millions of Jews, and so therefore a major concern is if you want to kill the Jews, you got to invade Poland and then Russia, which is what they did. There were a lot more Jews there, and of course they were more concerned, in all too often, in killing the Jews than they were in winning the war against Russia.
So
But of
what
course,
was the argument? What was the argument that caused them to believe that the Jews were an inferior race?
Yeah, again, I know that's interesting. He said they're inferior, not necessarily intellectually, but they're morally inferior. They're corrupt people, and they're not moral people, is what the focus was. And again, that goes back to Darwin, that some races are better than others, and IQ is part of it, intelligence is part of it, but also other things are part of it as well. So they just extended the Darwinian ideas from one group to another group. So, Crystal, you had another quick comment?
Yeah, so looking at the Scopes trial specifically, you brought up several times that it's usually ends up being it's science versus religion, all 30 years from way back when to now. So I was just wondering, like with regards to the trial itself, was that did it end up just being one trying to bash religion and then the other one I know he was trying to focus on the racism side, but would you say like there was any clear evidence to support like proper claims, or what were the specific actual claims being made by them?
Well, Darrow and his group basically wanted to do what they can to discredit religion, period. Not Christianity per se, but all theistic religion. That was their focus. And that's what they tried very hard to do. And in many ways, that wasn't what it was about. And they had to basically work to get that in there. And toward the end of the trial, the famous questioning where Darrow questioned Bryan's religious beliefs, they felt finally we can get this religious factor in there clearly in the trial. And of course, he did that with the questions. And Bryan accepted that part because Bryan felt that he could likewise question Darrow's religion. And ironically, the judge allowed Darrow to question Bryan's religion, but Bryan was never able to reciprocate and question Darwin's worldview. And so,
Right.
in many ways, Bryan just couldn't get in what he wanted to. He had to spend so much time defending, in many ways, himself and what he was doing that it was. But on the other hand, it was distorted because, of course, the ACLU, et cetera, wanted to distort it because they wanted to make the trial about something that really was not about.
Right.
So we
Instead of actually providing, sorry, Doug, you go ahead.
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes left. I would want to ask, what was the overall result of the Scopes trial and its effect on society?
Well, the overall result was he teaching evolution or wasn't he, Scopes? That really was it. Was he teaching it or wasn't he? And he clearly was teaching, or at least teaching some evolution. He actually wasn't a biology teacher. He did a review before the test, and there was on the review there's questions about evolution, and so they proved he was teaching evolution. Therefore, that was it. That was the whole question. And the jury found him guilty of teaching evolution, and it was appealed to the higher court. And the higher court basically didn't want to be involved. They just threw the whole case out. They threw it out on a technicality. I guess the judge is supposed to levy the fine, or the jury, one or the other, and it was wrong. So they threw it out because the fine wasn't levied by the right person.
9:30.
And so that was the end of the trial. And back then, of course, there were a lot more people who accepted the creation worldview. And so therefore, I think they felt it's best not to push this because we may end up losing more than we'll gain. And so they just didn't appeal it until later on. And of course, after the Scopes trial, there was a strong effort to indoctrinate young people into the evolution worldview. And today, now in the schools, it's pretty much K through 12. They cover, at least indirectly, evolution. So now it's widely taught. And so therefore now you have a much higher percent of people that accept the evolutionary worldview as opposed to the creation worldview.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing light to this historical trial that took place 100 years ago, the Scopes trial. Thank you, Jerry, for your participation in our TV show tonight, The Revolution Against Evolution. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.